Well, hello and welcome back to the Andrew Eborn Show with me, Andrew Eborn. Well, who else? I'll tell you, we welcome those who are shaping our world with wit, warmth, and wisdom. And today we're honoured to have a titan of the music industry, Steve Levine, joining us as he marks an astonishing 50 years as a recording professional in July 2025. From his punk rock roots at CBS Studios in 1975, working with the Clash and The Vibrators, to producing Culture Club's chart-topping anthems and the iconic 1985 Beach Boys album, Steve's career is a masterclass in innovation. He's a Grammy and Brit Award winner. He's now nurturing new talent through his Baltic jazz recording label with artists like the spellbinding Mavie, while mentoring the new generation at LIPA Lipper alongside Sir Paul McCartney. But Steve's not just shaping music, he's at the heart of one of the industry's fiercest debates, the role of AI in creativity, with the UK's Data Use and Access Bill backed by Sir Elton John and House of Lords in terms of challenging that bill and igniting global conversation. I'm delighted to welcome. Did you recognise any of that, Steve?
That was quite a long intro, isn't it? But then I guess when you've been doing it as long as I have, it's like your CV gets more and more expanded.
Oh, it's wonderful. But it is July, a phenomenal milestone for you.
Yes,
50th anniversary as a recording professional. You started, as I understand, as a tape op at
that's
CBS
right.
Studios in 1975 with punk legends like the Clash and the Vibrators working with them. Looking back at your glorious career, what's the one moment or project that feels like the heartbeat of your career? And touch on that for a moment.
Well, I think when you're so young, I started when I was 17, and you do have the hubris of youth. You just think you can do everything. And actually, I'd never walked into a recording studio before my job. I mean, I'd been there for an interview, but I think there's moments of highlights throughout one's career. But I think it's fair to say that working with Saylor and Bruce Johnson was a real change because Bruce Johnson at the time was the most successful Beach Boy. The band themselves were on a slight hiatus, and Bruce, because of his songwriting, had actually become an in-demand record producer. And so he produced the Sailor album, but he was the first person to really kind of mentor me and say, Steve, you know what? You're wasting your time as an engineer. You should be a record producer because your insight and also Sailor, for anyone that knows their music, was a very heavily synthesizer based band. And I just had a natural knack with the sound of synthesizers and the ability to make them work. And so Bruce very quickly would say, Steve, can you get me a synth sound that sounds a bit like a flute or a bass or whatever? And that becomes a skill that then other producers go, oh, ask Steve. He'll, and very famously years later, when my daughters were at university, I was so proud because some of her fellow students would say, oh, Dad, they've got an Ask Steve moment, a tech thing, because this was the beginnings of iPods and streaming and all that kind
Right.
of stuff. So I think that was a pivotal moment because that changed my view on where my positioning would be as a recording professional.
Yeah.
And then, of
And it's
course,
always wonderful, isn't it? The best accolades you can get are from your children. They're also your heart's critics, aren't they?
yes, I think I won huge brownie points around the sort of 90s when I was working with bands like 911 and those kind
Right.
of boy bands because I was recording at home and very often after school they'd be there, so they'd be making, Lee a cup of tea or when I was working with the Honeys, it was that, yeah, you can be a cool dad sometimes.
Oh, being a cool dad is absolutely essential, which is good. Well, you talked about the Beach Boys, 1985. Obviously, the Beach Boys released their 25th studio album, The Beach Boys. It was the first time it was produced by somebody other than Brian or
Yes,
the
indeed.
band. And obviously, it's 40 years. All these anniversaries are all coming up at
I know,
once,
it's
aren't they?
amazing, isn't it?
You're now going to do a new stereo remix, which is not a dance remix. What's going on?
Well, what has happened over the years, obviously technology has changed. And at the time, that album was cutting edge. It was one of the first, well, it was the very first time they'd used digital recording. And very specifically, sampling technology was in its infancy. And so, for example, Brian was very, very keen on using the device called the Fairlight, which is one of the first sampling devices. Cost the same price as a house then, but you can now sample on your phone. Technology's moved on, and I've been working with their management company, who are called Iconic. They're a really big management company. And as it is the anniversary and technology's moved on, we thought, well, why don't we do a fresh remix? So, not remastering. I will take the original multi tracks, which I now have in my studio here, and just give them in the same way, for example, that the early Star Wars films, they were able to kind of go back and just take away a couple of the little lines around the edges and just refresh it. It's that. So it's going to be exactly the same, but better. And we do have a couple of additional bonuses, which the fans have been calling on for years and years and years.
Well, give us a peek beneath the kimono. What sort of bonuses have you got?
Well, I think those that know the track listing now, just only the other day, on Sunday, I did an event at the Liverpool Philharmonic, which
Yeah,
was
well,
celebrating.
everybody loved you there. They all brought along their albums, get it
I
signed.
know it was fantastic. I mean, I was really not only impressed with the audience, but their participation. And what was really amazing was that some of them had some very rare copies of those albums. So they know, I think those that know the track listing can go down the track listing and imagine what might be possible with some of the contributors of said album. I won't give
Oh,
any
but
more, but the fans that were there said, "Oh, are you going to do?" And I went, "Wait and see." So
oh,
there is
you look at
for
you
the
with your poker
fans.
face.
Yes, there are for the fans. There's going to be some incredible stuff, and very recently, it was just a couple of days ago. There was a Culture Club documentary aired in the Tribeca Festival.
Yes.
I have contributed to that. It's going on Netflix later on, but I gave them some of my VHS footage that I had, and the guy that's in charge has actually cleaned up some of my Beach Boys footage as well. So I've got a couple of studio clips that are very, very rare that now, again, with modern technology, has enhanced that. So I think later on in the year, there'll be something very special for the fans.
Fantastic. And that's what I love. There's a positive side of technology and what that can do.
Absolutely, yes.
We've had some old recordings. You talk about Culture Club, obviously with the Beatles. They managed to tidy up
Yes,
John Lennon's voice. So great advances there. There is a downside which we're going to look at in a bit. But I want to
yes.
take you back to the Beach Boys. Let's just focus on them. Obviously, it was glorious times where you're in recording studios. It's obviously changed a lot.
Hmm.
Talk to me about a funny or chaotic moment that still makes you laugh during those sort of studio days back in the 80s.
Well, there is a fabulous period of time. So one of the greatest things of all particularly if you want specifically a Beach Boys story, there was one particular moment where Carl Wilson was very concerned when he was doing his vocals that as they hadn't been kind of in the studio for some time, maybe they weren't totally match fit. And very famously turned, and he was thinking he was turning into a lounge singer. And then one day he brought a gold lamé suit and wore it to the studio, which was absolutely incredible. And what was so funny was that that was the day after that we went to see Stevie Wonder, who said, "I'd love to work on this record," and that the fans know that Stevie Wonder's involved in the record. And Stevie at the time had a very advanced piece of technology that was a Braille typewriter, so he could effectively type a message and it would give a kind of like a Stephen Hawking style computer voice, but far more sophisticated than that, to do a message. And he was really encouraging Carl because those that know, Carl was married to Gina Martin, who is Dean
Yes.
Martin's daughter. In fact, my wife and I actually went to the wedding. I actually, in the line, Karen and I have shaken the hand of Dean Martin.
Ah,
But just the whole point of every time I sort of think of cabaret music and lounge music, I think for those I've got such fond memories of Carl with that. And on a more general one of the guests at the Liverpool Philharmonic brought a selection of photographs that she'd taken outside the Red Bus Studios where we worked originally, because it's been in many documentaries. But when George used to come to the studio, a number of young girls would hang around the studio, including Naomi Campbell, who has said many, many times, she was like 16, I think, or something like
right,
that.
right.
But this lady was one of those girls, and she's got some pictures of George and I going into the studio from 1983, 84. It's incredible.
Oh,
That is
fantastic.
fan dedication, isn't it?
Oh, it totally is, and what I love is the outpouring of love for you when you meet the fans. How does that make you feel?
Very proud actually, because I'm not an artist. I'm a record producer, and what's lovely is that they are talking in that language.
Yeah,
When they if I'm with George, for example, then people will want pictures with George and whatever it is that they want, autographs and things. With me, it is almost certainly the record sleeves, and that's the thing with digital streaming services. People love credits. And so very often when somebody brings an album, it'll be they want me to sign on the credit page, or
right.
something like that. That's really lovely. It is really lovely.
No, glorious. But we talk about Culture Club. I mean, you produced their timeless hits like Karma Chameleon
Yeah.
and the three multi-platinum albums, upcoming world tour celebrating those early records. Talk to me about some of the behind-the-scenes stuff, because what I always like to do on the show, I always say that if you don't read the newspapers, you're ill-informed. If you read them, you're misinformed. What's the truth? What's the truth about Boy George and Culture Club? And share one of those precious moments.
Well, I think it's fair to say that there were a lot of tensions. It's been widely reported about John and George's relationship, which was a genuinely fond, loving relationship. There's no question about that. But of course, like any kind of couple, there are tensions. And those tensions are always difficult in the recording studio because everybody has an ego, but an ego in the sense of wanting to make the best recording they had. And that is absolutely true of all of us. And in fact, that came alive very much. My wife and I went to the Liverpool Arena show just at Christmas, and it was obviously sold out. But we were in the sort of bit at the front where the people had got the premium tickets. And those that saw the show, they did the two albums back to back. And then at the encore, they did all the B-sides and additional tracks that they'd never, ever played live before. And Roy told some of the stories, particularly on the B-side of Karma Chameleon, where that was such an intense moment to get that beautiful performance from George and captured it beautifully. And what was so incredible in, the arenas are, I can't remember the capacity, but it's pretty big. It was silent. Absolutely. No one was talking. You could hear a pin drop as George did his vocals. So that's where those tensions came from in terms of wanting to make the very best record we can. And they were always a fantastic live band. I really remember an early Guardian review when we played in London. And I was doing the sound on the first tour because we didn't have any money, and B, we all wanted it to sound as good as possible. And I remember the Guardian doing a review to say, they were fantastic live, the sound was fantastic, the performance was good. It goes to show they're not just a studio band.
Ah.
Greatest compliment ever.
No,
So
absolutely. So, if you could produce a dream collaboration, because you've got such a diverse portfolio, if you like, but a dream collaboration between Culture Club's Boy George and, say, a punk act like The Clash from your early days, what kind of track would you cook up, and who would be pulling the best studio prank?
Well, I think that's a really good question because if those that know George's history, he was in punk bands before he started. And in
Absolutely.
fact, he was with Annabelle in Bow Wow Wow. And, those stories are not entirely true of him her being discovered the way she was discovered. In fact, it was my keyboard player that discovered her because we lived in Hampstead at the time and
Right.
she worked in the dry cleaners in West Hampstead. So Dave Fishel discovered Annabelle, not Malcolm McLaren. But anyway,
Never let the
that's a
truth
whole,
stand in the way of good stories.
yes, and that is the truth. That is absolutely the truth. However, in that band, you had the two, if you like, vocal differences. Annabelle, who had an absolutely fantastic punk voice, but George, who had the soul voice. And I think, if you were to marry those two things together, that would be that's a very interesting sound. Unfortunately, they didn't last long enough to do any proper studio recordings. But yes, I love the idea of mixing and matching. But I think George's voice now, with it having that lower timbre, he'd be so great with certainly somebody like Adele, those two voices would sound phenomenal together, or Dua Lipa, one of those, great younger singers that's got a really incredible voice.
Yeah,
Those
fantastic. And
two
you heard
work.
it here first on the Andrew Eborn Show. Look how
Yeah,
that collaboration.
I'm available. Yeah.
Fantastic. Talking about, I mean, you don't stop those two, do you? You've got Baltic jazz recordings now. You're nurturing a new generation
Mm,
with artists like Mavie, whose singles So Glad, brilliant stuff. But
yes.
pure sonic bliss with those Chicago horns and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you paint a picture of a moment in the studio with Mavie and NT Jones where you all just knew you captured something special? And what makes her stand out in today's crowded music scene?
Well, funnily enough, the reason that we did that was because previously I'd recorded with MT Jones Forever and a Day. And when Mavie heard it, she played me the greatest compliment. She said, that really sounds like Time Clock of the Heart, but for now, because it is, everyone knows the kind of stuff I really love. And I love Philadelphia International. And I'm, really proud that through my radio series, The Record Producers, I got to interview my hero record producers. So I've interviewed Tom Bell, Gamble and Huff, Holland Dozy Holland. Those are Quincy Jones. They're my heroes. And when you talk to those people, you're talking as a recording professional. You're not talking of anything other than that. We all talk tech, it's incredible. And so she listened to that track and said, oh, that's so soulful. It really sounds like that. And she's a big Culture Club fan. She said, I'd love to do something like that. And so Mikey and I sort of started an idea, and then she came to the studio, and it did, as the reviews have said, it came very organically, and she's got such a lovely voice and a lovely strong lyrical sense of things. She's a very strong woman, and the lyrical power of those words, I think, is really, really important. So yes, and it's for me just so brilliant to we're talking about 50 years, but I've got current records. Maeve is just on the BBC Wales A list, and I think that is absolutely as it should be. She is a lovely artist, and when you hear the vocals, but particularly hear the warmth of the lyric, I think that's because great soul music, when people listen back to say Marvin Gaye and things like that, they were great soul songs, but there was a story in the words. They were really, really important. What's going on? Let's get it. They're really important statements and not just fluffy around the edges. And I think you can have both in music. You absolutely can.
Oh no, absolutely, and that's the joy of it, and that's one of the criticisms, if you like, of things like the Eurovision Song Contest. Is and I have a lot of songwriters on the show, and they say the one thing that nobody credited was actually the songwriters.
Yes, yes. And it's a tough job. I have a really weird curveball with that because a few years ago I produced the Russian entry Alsu, which came second.
I
And it was
remember,
big-
yes.
yes, and that was talking of songwriters. So that came to me because it was a song that was presented to me. The very famous impresario Simon Napier Bell was representing her at
Yes.
the time, and Simon said to me, "I've got this artist Alsu. We found this song. Could you kind of put it together?" And that's sort of how that became. So in this strange way, I've actually had success in Eurovision, even though not directly.
And do you like Eurovision as a concept?
It's changed so much. I think when it first started, it was actually a really good idea. As you mentioned, songwriting, because they in the sort of olden days, there used to be you entered your songs, anyone could enter,
Right.
and then there was the original board of BASCA, which is the British Academy of Composers and Songwriters, used to judge them all, present their best selection to the BBC, and then sometimes they did the live show, sometimes they just did a lucky dip. But what was encouraging is it encouraged grassroots songwriting.
Right.
Maybe has disappeared a little bit now in the way that you have to enter, and the gatekeeping is so high. But I think there's nothing better than those things that encourage songwriting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Now, talking about encouraging the next generation, you've
Yeah,
been a Leaper companion for over 20 years. You're
yeah.
mentoring aspiring producers alongside the wonderful Sir Paul McCartney and presenting the Future Producer Prize. What's the funniest or most surreal piece of advice Paul's ever shared with you, and how's it shaped the way you guide the next generation?
Um, Paul is fantastic, and obviously, he is so proud of it. Testament to the pictures just the other day of when Bruce Springsteen came to Lipper, which is
Yes.
absolutely fantastic. There's two, there's two things that Paul, two great stories I got for Paul. So just before lockdown, he said to me, now those that know, he refers to Mike, his brother, as our kid. So just as he's
Yes.
going, he came up to me and said, "Our kid's going to phone you. He wants a favor off of you." And I went, "What?" So then Mike called me and said, "I've just found a box of really rare tapes. Do you have a machine that can play those tapes back and transfer them? They're mono 7.5 IPS tapes recorded in the very sort of mid 60s, but they feature Paul." So I said, as it happens, I actually do have a brand new machine because I had a machine that went in for repair, and that went to Germany to be repaired. And this guy's a real enthusiast, and he said, "Do you love these machines?" And I said, "I do." He said, "I've got a brand new one in the box, never been opened. You can have it." It was like 200 euros or something. So I said to Mike, "I've got a brand new machine that I can play on, so it'll be as good as it possibly can." So that was one little story. And then the other story, just after lockdown, because of lockdown, they had to do two graduations in one day,
Right.
which meant the first graduation was more private. It didn't have, it only had the families. It didn't have the audience that he normally does. And then the second one was the friends and families. So on the first day, the sort of green room, as it were, was more empty. And so I was there. And what Paul always encourages is the sound and the team are from Lipper. So I'm using this mic now, but on the show they use lapel mics. So the engineer was coming, and I'm talking to Paul about some software that because again, Paul is super techie. We were talking about a new piece of software and how brilliant it was. And the sound engineer was putting the microphone on Paul's shirt, and he was like kind of slightly shaking, because obviously, it's Paul McCartney.
Yes, of course.
And Paul paid me the best sort of interesting compliment. He said, "Oh, give that to Steve. That's the sort of thing he does." So at least in Paul's mind, he knows I can put the lapel mic on properly.
Yeah, brilliant. What I love about him as well is those people in the public eye, and we have a number of people on the show and people I know personally. It's those who just make people feel comfortable, isn't it? Because
Absolutely.
but they all say that people's IQ goes down by about 20 points when they meet a celebrity.
Well, Paul, absolutely. You're absolutely right. Not only does he make them feel very comfortable, but when he has the one-to-one with the songwriting students, that is one of the most brilliant moments and one of the greatest gifts that he can give it. And again, like I was saying earlier with producer to producer, when he's in the room with the students, and I know this because I've spoken to him, it's songwriter to songwriter. It's nothing more than that. And that is absolutely the key, the fundamental key to what we all feel when we write a song.
Yeah, no, absolutely fantastic. So looking back at your glorious 50-year career, is there a moment that brought you to tears, whether from joy, frustration, or sheer beauty? And what made that moment so unforgettable?
I was brought to tears. I'll tell you the story because it does have a complete ending. So there was one point during the Beach Boys sessions when I was actually drawn to tears. I was working on a particular track, and I can mention his name now because it's all been under. So Al Jardine came in and said, "There's something wrong with this." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, I really like the vocals at the front, but I want them in the key change. I think it would boost the song." And I said, "Excellent. Well, go out and we'll record them again." And then he said, "But can't you just change them? You've got your Fairlight. You can just change them." Now, in those days, you couldn't do the kind of things you can do today. It was quite a complicated method to change the key of the first part of the song to the second part. And then he just sort of stormed out and said, I won't do all the, Anyway, so in Los Angeles, where we're recording studios in Los Angeles have like an alleyway at the back of them where you park
Right.
the cars. So I thought, you know what, I've had it here, and I was really upset. There's me. I've got the number one single in the UK and America and the number one album. It couldn't get any better than that. Both coasts had Color by Numbers, the album, and Come, I thought, ah. So I'm sat at the back of the car park, and I'm really upset. And in those days, what used to happen was Brian would drive into the studio on his own, but he would be followed by his assistant in another car. And Brian had, for those that knows American cars, Brian had a Pinto, which is like I don't know what, it's, I guess a Ford Fiesta. It's like the
Yes,
cheapest.
best comparison, Ford Fiesta, I think,
Yeah,
probably
it's
right.
like
Yeah.
so tiny. And so, anyway, so I see this chocolate brown Pinto coming into the car park, but no, Carlos was his assistant's name, but no
Yes.
Carlos because there was a lot of traffic. Brian gets out of the car and says, "What's the matter?" And I said, "I have had it with Al. I am so upset." He sat down, and on American car parks, they have that sort of like bleacher thing, with the
Yes,
name.
yes.
Yeah, it's like a curb, isn't it? A raised curb. I
Yeah.
was sat on that. Brian sat next to me, and I'll never forget this moment. He put his arm around me and he said, "I know what you're going through. They used to do that to me all the time." Isn't that incredible? And then, but it has a very happy ending because when they were doing the Brian Wilson tour, actually here in Liverpool, again, that was just before lockdown, I think. Al came up to me and said, "Can I just apologise?" There's a lot of water under the bridge, and I said, "Of course, Al. It's a moment in history, so it has a very happy ending." But that moment of Brian putting his arm around me and saying, "I know what you're going through. It happened to me all the time." And you read those stories of when he was working on Pet Sounds. That's again, Brian is really, really funny. I mean, I've got some great moments where, he'd do things in the studio that were absolutely hilarious. I mean, great sense of humor. There's one day he'd taken my company T-shirt, he'd taken it home and put it on. And then when when he opened it, and more recently, when I did the record producers, I had this is so mad. I've got a picture of it to prove it.
Oh, yes.
My daughter bought me a pink linen shirt because I was going to California. Brian had the same shirt on. How he knew I was. So I opened the door, and Brian's got the same shirt on, and I
Brilliant.
have got a picture of it. It's like a small, funny thing.
Oh no, we love. We had to share that picture. We put it in somewhere. It'd be fantastic. So,
Yes.
if you go back to 1975 and you whisper one piece of advice into those $1 million ears, whilst you were a tape op at cell phone at CBS, what would it be?
That's a great question, but I have a fantastic answer. Check every royalty statement and question every royalty statement.
Great advice. And talking of questioning everything,
Yeah.
AI and the
Yes.
future of music. You probably know that I speak around the world on AI. I want to put
Yes,
the
I do.
AI into Britain. And we've had lots of great guests on the Andrew Eborn Show talking about the UK's data use and access bill. It's obviously sparked a firestorm with the
Yes.
House of Lords voting very recently, 221, I think it was, to
Yeah.
116 on June the 4th, to demand transparency from AI companies. We've also had Sir Elton John speaking very publicly about this, talking about it theft on a high scale. As someone who's always embracing cutting edge technology, we touched on some of that, Steve, as well.
Mhm.
Where do you see AI inspiring creativity in the studio, and where do you draw the line to protect artists' souls and livelihoods?
Well, there's two parts, and as Kevin Brennan, who is in the House of Lords, has been, he's a big champion of our rights. I think there's two parts to it. Let's look at the negative part first. Currently, PRS and PPL in the UK, but there are agencies all around the world. But let's think of the UK now as we're discussing the UK bill. PRS and PPL have the mechanisms in place that if you wish to use a piece of music in a film or a television program or an advert, you go to the publisher for the songwriting and you go to the record company for the sound recording and you agree what's called a sync license. Everybody's happy. And what often happens today is you have what's called favoured nations, so that if, for example, they agree £1,000 for the publishing, then the sound recording will have a similar value. Absolutely, licensing works. Absolutely, there's no question about it. And if you're using a documentary and you're using what's called library music, there is a licensing framework in place. That all works brilliantly. Artists get paid, publishers get paid, record companies get paid, and also, more importantly, which people often forget, in the case of PPL, the musicians who've contributed to the recording, producers, the musicians, all get paid as well when it's broadcast. So that all works really well. What AI is trying to say is we'd like to analyze that music. The terrible terms they use are scraping and harvesting. We'd like
Yes.
to harvest that data from a particular track, but not pay you any money. And if you don't want us to harvest it, you have to tell us that it's exempt. Now, it is absolutely impossible. If you look at like artists like Mavie and the brand new artist I'm working with, Jess Edie, it's impossible for them to contact every potential current AI company, of which there's a list of hundreds, and any futures and say, please don't use my music. What would be far better would be for the mechanism that we have in place for an AI company to go to the licensing and say, we would like to use Mavie's track to harvest the vocals, the bass line, and this is the fee that we're going to pay. And when we create an algorithm, we will then treat that as a license and that you'll continue to get income, and it can be whatever the agreed rate is, just as when the streaming platforms negotiated their fees for the publishers and the sound recordings. If you press a button on Spotify, hear a track, it goes into a log, and eventually that money comes back to the composers and the producers and the record company sound recording owners. So there is something in place. What they're saying is wipe all that away. The default should be, as Kevin Brennan and many others are saying, the default should be off, as in there's no consent, but come to any person. Because I think a good analogy here is the early days of sampling.
Yes.
When hip hop first started using samples from classic jazz and soul records, the very first few years were a little bit of a Wild West. However, now, if you wish to use a sample from any record, not only do you often get the consent and blessing of the original copyright owners, but a fee is put into place. And there are artists that have benefited enormously from samples being used in their records that perhaps were not successful first time round. Beyonce's on tour at the moment. Well, the Chi-Lites, that chunk of Crazy in Love is from a Chi-Lites record.
Yes.
That was not a big hit first, not as big as it became with Beyonce. So there's a positive upside to licensing. So that's what we have in place. That cavalier attitude of we can just sample everything or harvest everything and then we'll sort it out later. That's not going to work. I did see the other day, Sir Lucian Grange was having a conversation with an American company where they were looking at using some form of logging, so that not only if the consent was given to analyze a particular track, the algorithm would be robust enough to, if that algorithm is then used on something else, to pass it back to the original copyright owners, and that would then, I guess, generate a royalty. That's if that could be done, that's exactly what we want.
Yeah,
No
and,
one's
and
saying
the
no.
problem is, yeah, the problem is this, Steve, isn't it? Is that, well, firstly, there's the admin side. You're right. As an owner of rights, and I always say
Yeah,
that intellectual property is like any other property. If you take it without permission, that is theft. It's very straightforward.
absolutely,
Um,
absolutely.
the difficulty, what the tech companies would argue, is actually administratively, they have to rely on not just one or two licenses, but actually they want to scrape the whole of the internet to get a feel from all sorts of different artists. And administratively, that would be impossible for them to do. What's your response to that?
That's not true because Netflix, as an example, can quite happily license whatever music they want. They can also go directly to composers and have music commissioned specifically. So no, that's rubbish. They're just being really lazy. They're making it difficult. And let's be clear here. There are situations that I've seen. If anyone infringes any of the IP's own thing, like for example, I've seen situations where Google have gone after people for using logos that are a bit similar. So they're quite happy to protect their own intellectual property, but they're cavalier with everybody else's. So I literally, that's not, true. And B, as we move forward, data is king. They manage data. So if they can't get their house in order, nobody can. Because when you have, it doesn't matter if it's trillions of lines of data, the data is somewhere. So just manage it and get on with it.
No, absolutely. And I always say data is the new currency. The other thing is the financial side of it. And Grimes, I have Elon Musk's father on my show, Errol, all the time, and we always unpack. And she famously said, well, what she'll do with the AI companies, she'll split the royalties, if you like, or split the income on that sort of basis, 50-50. When you have lots and lots of different artists, and publishing itself is talking about pennies anyway,
Yeah, yes.
how do you make money?
Well, it's just scale, economies of scale. I mean, if every single person on this planet had a Spotify or an Apple Music or an Amazon Music subscription, it would make a huge difference. So it is just the numbers game. You know, if a track is played on the BBC or ITV or Sky, it generates a certain amount of money. So that per play money is, probably the most robust. If something is played on Spotify, I think somebody did the calculations, and don't overly quote me on this, but I think it's in the circle of around 6,000 plays can get you a cup of coffee.
Yeah,
So it's small
but
amount.
that's quite good. I
Yeah,
I
yeah.
remember
But
Gary
but
Newman talking about his income on Spotify. I think he said it was like £36 for a million
yeah, it's
things.
it's a
But
very, very well. I'm talking about somebody that owns the publishing and the sound recording.
yes,
You own the 100%, which a lot of smaller artists do. So their numbers are lower, but at least their equity is great. This is why still the greatest income from small emerging bands is from physical albums, T-shirts,
yeah.
banners, key rings, pens, any sort of merchandise. That's still the more valuable part, and fans embrace that. But I think, yeah, it is a numbers game. What the AI companies have to do is they have to license what they intend to harvest the data from, license it correctly, and when that algorithm is built, the ongoing line of that, what they call the long tail, is then properly compensated because the mechanisms are there. I still get income from my existing recordings because of PRS and PPL in the UK, and in America you've got ASCAP and BMI that looks after the publishing. So it can be done, and the infrastructure is there, and PPL and PRS have been going for PRS is over 100 years, and I think we're coming up to 100 years on PPL. So it can be done. It's just they're being really lazy, and they also want to ride roughshod over everybody's rights.
Okay, fantastic. Very clear on that. And I
Yeah.
think all of the guests that I've had on here, including people like Ellis Rich and
Yeah.
and Mike Batt and
Yes, and I know them both very well.
they are big advocates and so on and so forth. So
But
yes,
positive, right? There is a lot of really positive stuff. So if we go back to music creation in the recording studio, there are tools available that are not infringing copyrights that do allow less experienced users to create in a better way. So one of the most simple ways is, for example, if say you've got this vocal mic here. One of the pieces of software that I have from a company called Universal Audio is it takes this, not this exact mic, but you can take this microphone and you can superimpose the sonic character of another microphone on top of it. So that means that if you've got a fairly limited budget, you can buy a less expensive microphone, but get the sonic quality of a slightly more expensive microphone, because a microphone can be from a few £100s to several £1,000s. So
Yeah.
that's very positive. There are also in some of the software that we use to create. I use Logic Audio, but there's Pro Tools, there's many others. There are tools within that that are what they call kind of AI enhanced.
Right.
So, for example, if you type in your chord progression, the AI will now know, okay, you've put in, a C and an F and a G. So go, okay, well, that's going to be in the key of C major. And here's a couple of suggested other chords that might sound quite nice with it, because it's looking at the key, because it can put all the music theory in it, which is, again, not stealing anyone's right. Music theory is available to all, but it can very far make a kind of table very quickly, give somebody that's less experienced a couple of sound options from a musical point of view. And then the same applies with perhaps drum programming. If you don't have a drummer, you can say, well, I'd like a beat, I put this kind of thing in, and it might suggest, oh, perhaps this drum fill would be nice. So that's for somebody that is creative. On a level of somebody that perhaps has a disability, it's phenomenally powerful, because there are so many people that have a voice to share. And if, again, using the hip hop example, when hip hop first started, most of those artists were sampling other people's records, creating beats, but they were then essentially rapping on the top of it, but with lyrics that were testament to their circumstances. So just as I was mentioning earlier with Marvin Gaye, Marvin Gaye was commenting on America as it was in the 60s with, terrible civil rights. Both, a generation later, hip hop artists, the first generation of hip hop artists, were commenting on their socials, but they weren't necessarily playing the tracks. They were using samples to create it. So we have a situation now where people that may be physically disabled, that can't play a regular keyboard or a regular guitar, can have access to music creation, and then they can put their lyrics or their words or whatever. And indeed, if somebody even has problems with their voice, there are tools to help that as well. And so on a positive creative level, it's brilliant, and that's only going to get better and better and better. So I fully endorse AI when it's used creatively, because it's empowering the next generation. But I have great problems with the generation that, particularly some of my students, how are they going to earn a living if the very first recordings they release are scraped and harvested, and someone can do a sound alike within seconds of what they've done?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And very, very clear. And lots of people in the music industry have to understand that without the appropriate safeguards in place, people will be deprived of their livelihoods. Steve Levine, it's been an absolute joy having you on the show. We will get you back very, very soon. But for now, Steve
Thank
Levine,
you.
thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Andrew.